snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by RockyTopInsider.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome in to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com, joined by our staff writer here at RTI, Ben McKee, and he's also the co-host and producer of the Swain Event morning radio show. You can check that out on the Swain Event app. It's free for Android and iPhone, or Android devices and Apple devices. You can also watch the Swain Event TV on Periscope and Facebook Live every morning from 7 to 10 Eastern. It's a great show. Jason Swain, former Tennessee receiver, is the main host, and Ben helps out on the show. As for the RTI Podcast, we appreciate all of you tuning in for another episode here. This will be the second one this week, and we're hopefully moving forward, we'll be able to give you at least 2 episodes per week. We're heading into the last actual week of fall camp because we have 2 more weeks of practice, but that last week of practice before the season starts will be technically fall camp, it'll be Tennessee preparing for Georgia State. So Ben, as we're recording this podcast on Friday, we're 15 days away, we're 2 weeks away, we're Juwan Jennings days away from the season beginning. It's finally almost here. We're almost there. We're just 2 more weeks to go. We actually have, next weekend, or actually, no, I think is it this weekend that we have football now? I'm trying to remember when it is now, but the Florida and...
Next weekend.
Yeah, Florida and Miami play next weekend, you're right, because they have the bye week on the opening weekend. But Florida and Miami, and I think there's another game too, but that's a big one. We'll be playing next weekend, so we have football in a week away, essentially. So we're almost there, but this topic, or this podcast, will be all Tennessee-related content, and we have kind of 2 main topics we're wanting to discuss on this episode of the podcast. Ben, there's been a lot made this week, and you reported on it. I think early on maybe Tuesday at practice this week when Tennessee was back out there after taking Monday off and after having the closed scrimmage on Sunday. But there's been a lot made this week of the offensive line group, and not just the offensive line in general, because that's definitely a very scrutinized position grouping right now with Tennessee because of how they performed last year, but specifically with the fact that it's not just been Will Friend that's been over there with the offensive line group and, coaching them up and getting mad and kind of yelling at the guys, and that's nothing new. That happens. That happens in the spring. That happens with every offensive line coach. Offensive line coaches are typically some of the most vocal and usually some of the most dirty-mouthed coaches on the entire staff. I've noticed that with Tennessee, or under Pruitt, under Butch Jones, when we've been covering practices. Usually the O-line coaches are some of the most foul-mouthed of the groups of the guys over there. But it's not just been Will Friend that's been getting after it. We've seen Jim Chaney come over, and most of the time anyway, he's been spending a lot of times with the offensive line. That's nothing new, but lately he's been getting, as you've mentioned in the practice reports and stuff, Ben, earlier this week. I mean, he was getting pretty vocal with the guys, and it showed up in one of our practice videos too, of him getting very vocal with the offensive line, trying to get them to perform better. And he said, I think one of the quotes I remember hearing someone say about it was, "You're not going to be the reason my quarterback gets hurt," which that's a pretty strong statement, and that's also pretty accurate. Garantano got blasted a few times last year, and it wasn't necessarily always his fault when he got hit the way he did. So, but there's been a lot of fan reaction and even some media reaction too to the fact that Chaney's been over there with the offensive line, and people are saying, if Tennessee's paying Will Friend all this money, I think he's the second highest paid offensive line coach in the country, only behind Sam Pittman at Georgia. Why is Chaney going over and helping out? Shouldn't Will Friend be able to do this? And essentially, there's been a lot of talk about Will Friend, and is he in over his head? Is he a weak link? And all this, just a bunch of different stuff about essentially kind of trashing Will Friend from what I've noticed. And people are saying, is he going to be a problem? Is this a problem? And Ben, I'm curious on your thoughts on it from someone who's been at practice every single day that practice has been open. I know what my opinion is on this. I think it's being overblown pretty significantly. To me, Jim Chaney, when I was with you at practices and stuff, I mean, he was sometimes with the quarterbacks and the receivers, and he was watching the quarterbacks and everything, but most of the time he was with the offensive line group, and once again, I mean, he's been vocal. He's a very vocal guy himself. I think it's just something that's being kind of overblown, but I'm curious if you think it's as overblown as I do, or if you think there's something to it. What do you make of the Jim Chaney Will Friend situation going on that's happened this past week? Because we also have the fact that the offensive line during the last open practice, which was, I guess, Wednesday, they'll be having one today too, but Wednesday they moved the offensive line group all the way to the other side of the field where the running backs usually are, and they said that don't do video of them. They're kind of feeling crowded. I think is what you told me they said, Ben. So you have that too, and that's a whole different conversation to have about why they did that. But I'm curious on your thoughts on this whole Jim Chaney, Will Friend, and offensive line situation.
Yeah, well, there's kind of two conversations to it. There's the, is it a bad thing that Will Friend and Jim Chaney are jumping down the offensive line's back in consecutive days? Does that not bode well for the regular season and the offensive line coming along and being productive? So there's that conversation, and then there's the conversation of, well, why is Jim Chaney helping out with the offensive line so much? So that question, why is Jim Chaney helping out with the offensive line so much? I think it's a ridiculous narrative that is starting to be put together by some of the fans that do not like him, quite frankly. And for whatever reason, that they assume that just because a coach is helping with a position on the staff, or a position on the field, that it's a weak link all of a sudden, or that coach is a weak link just based off of what happened last year. Fans already don't like Will Friend. So now it's almost as if every opportunity that they have, and it's not all fans, but a certain amount of fans, a certain amount of people are going to jump down his back at every opportunity given. So there's two conversations. That one I think is overblown. I think the reason Jim Chaney is with Will Friend is because, quite frankly, that offensive line was butt booty terrible last year. Without Trey Smith, without Brandon Kennedy, in my opinion, it wasn't even a Division I offensive line. That's how bad it was, and that's how bad it performed. So because of that, if I'm the head coach and I have an offensive line that bad, I'm going to have as many coaches helping out with the offensive line as possible. Mm-hmm. It's all hands on deck at that point. Jim Chaney, obviously helping out. Will Friend, he's the offensive line coach. You have, unfortunately, you have several former offensive line men who are helping out in practice, giving pointers, helping with drills such as Chance Hall. All the names are slipping my mind at the Tanner Antonucci. Yeah. There's so many former offensive linemen that are Ray Rawlerson, so many former offensive linemen who have taken medical red shirts and are now helping out. So you've got so much help over there, and then you even have other position coaches stepping in at times to kind of look, and Brian Niedermeyer plays a huge role when the tight ends and the tackles pair up to go through blocking schemes and whatnot. So I say all that to say I think Jim Chaney is helping with the offensive line because, A, it needs to be all hands on deck based off of last year's performance. And just to take a little step back even further, last year's performance was not Will Friend's fault. Will Friend was dealt a bad hand. I don't know whether he's going to prove to be a good offensive line coach. I don't know whether he's a good offensive line coach right now. But what I do know is it is entirely unfair to judge him this early. I think it is too early to be to have just a defined opinion on Will Friend based off the circumstances he walked into. Those circumstances he was given was not his fault. Now, if you want to question the amount of false starts and whatnot, then I completely understand that because that is the one area that should have been coached up last year, and that is the one thing that the offensive line coach and offensive coordinator, they can prevent, is just making sure guys are lined up, making sure they're not taking stupid penalties or committing stupid penalties. So I understand that argument of things, and I'm not going to argue against that. But I will say, being at practice last year and just hearing from people within the program and people who were at practice as well, Will Friend was teaching everything correctly. Will Friend was teaching the proper fundamentals, and then 2 seconds later, an offensive lineman that ended up transferring to USC would go do the opposite. Or he was teaching the correct scheme, and then in the game, a former offensive lineman that transferred to USC would go out and get a false start. So I don't know how much you put on that on Will Friend. I don't know how much you put on the circumstances, but I know one thing, and that's you can't have a defined thought on him. You can't define whether he's good or bad just yet. That's still – you still have to wait. We're still in wait-and-see mode. At least I am. So because of how bad the offensive line was, that is why Jim Chaney is working with the offensive line. And I think the freak out over it is ridiculous, and it's just another way for a certain segment of fans to pile on Will Friend because they already have this pre-thought on him. They've already made up their mind on him, so they're just using this to pile on in the sense of, okay, is this a good thing for the season? How much Will Friend and Jim Chaney has gotten on to the offensive line this week. And the two practices that we saw this week, Tuesday and Wednesday, the offensive line did not have good days, at least in the open portion. Last night they practiced. We did not get to see any of that. So who knows how the offensive line performed last night. But on Tuesday and Wednesday in the open portion, they did not perform well whatsoever. I'd never seen Jim Chaney as agitated as he was, just constantly getting on to guys for a lack of technique. He was throwing guys out of the drill, including upperclassmen. He was making guys redo reps. He was making the whole group redo reps. He was, getting on the guys for not holding the tackling dummy correctly, the tackling pad. It's just one thing after another. He did not like anything on Tuesday, and then they kept the offensive line in their same spot the next day during practice, but they told us not to take video of them and instead opened up the running backs and allowed us to walk in between the fields to go look at the running back in an effort to make up for that. So it hasn't been a great week for the offensive line, and I think kind of similar to Jim Chaney working with Will Friend, or whether or not Will Friend is a good offensive line coach, I think the jury is still out on whether it's a bad thing that the offensive line had two consecutive bad practices. I think if this trend continues for a week, that's when it's probably a really bad sign. But for now, I just think it's the middle of fall camp. Every unit on every team in America this time of year is going to have a bad practice or so. It's just part of it. It happens at the middle school level, the high school level, the college level, and the NFL level. Practice. Fall camp is so long. There are so many practices. Every day is not going to be good. You're going to have bad days, and sometimes you're going to have back-to-back bad days. So that isn't a concern. It's a concern when the trend continues for a week. So here in a second, you and I are going to get into maybe what we want to see more out of in regards to particular players going forward as we finish up fall camp. But this is one thing that I'll be watching today and then going into next week's final week of fall camp. Is this a trend with the offensive line? If it is, then it's time to worry. If it's not, then they just simply had 2 bad days of practice.
Yeah, and to go back to your point too about kind of the fans ragging on Will Friend. He's a guy that kind of took. I mean, really, it seems like not as soon as he was hired, essentially, but really pretty early on. Obviously, because Tennessee's offensive line struggled, pretty early on against West Virginia. Then they struggled against lesser opponents. But it seemed like this fan base, and not everyone, obviously, but as you mentioned, a select amount of people, a certain amount of people have kind of piled on to Will Friend and are very much against Will Friend. It feels like it just seems like for whatever reason, every year or with every coaching staff, there's one assistant coach that the fan base, and this isn't just a Tennessee, this is every single fan base. I know it has this issue, of the major universities, of SEC schools and Big Ten schools and whatnot. But it just seems like for every year, every time there's a different kind of coaching change, Vol fans like to zero in on a guy, and just for whatever reason, he can't do anything right. Will Friend seems to be that way under Jeremy Pruitt. Obviously, you also had Tyson Helton kind of get that a little bit last year too, but Will Friend, I think, more so to an extent. You look under Butch Jones, it was Zach Azzani for the longest time got a lot of crap from Vol fans. Then he ended up going into the NFL, and I mean, he's still coaching the NFL, and he seems like he's doing pretty well for himself. You also had I'm only talking about the guys who have unwarranted crap thrown at them, because I don't think Azzanni, the amount of stuff he had thrown at him wasn't warranted. Whereas, Larry Scott, Mike Canales, obviously those are more warranted. They did not perform well at all at Tennessee. Even Mike DeBoer was crapped on, and that's a little more understandable, because when he was hired, he was the Olympic swim coach at Michigan when he was hired. He hadn't coached in college football in a while, so that made sense. Then when he actually was on the field, or I guess in the box, and was coaching, he did a better job than I expected him to, and he ended up being one of the better. Probably you could argue he was the most successful OC Tennessee had since Jim Chaney after he left after 2012. So I would agree with you, Ben, that it seems like for whatever reason, some people are just, they have their minds made up on Will Friend, that it doesn't matter what happens, that they're not going to change their opinion on him. But I also would agree with you that it's just, to me, it's too early to really have a large opinion on him and to really know what he brings to the table. Yeah, I look at what he's done at his previous stops, and he's been pretty successful at his other stops. So I think he's overpaid a little bit, yeah, but there are a lot of coaches out there who are overpaid, at not just head coaches or coordinators, but position coaches, just at all kinds of different levels and different schools. And I don't think Will Friend is the most egregiously overpaid coach out there. But do I think he's worth $800,000? Not yet, but he could develop into that. And like you said, Ben, he didn't have the ingredients. You can't expect, if you want to look at a five-star chef in Paris, you can't expect him or her, that chef, to go make a world-class meal if you go to the Dollar General and get some basic, just off-brand ingredients and give them just really cheap stuff and say, hey, here, make a high-quality cuisine. They can probably make it better than you or I could, but they're not going to be able to make something they could make at a Parisian kitchen at a high-quality, high-dining restaurant. Right now, simply put, Will Friend doesn't have the ingredients to make to go back to that analogy, to make a high quality fine dining meal. He's got more this year with guys like Darnell Wright and Manya Morris coming in, and you also have the fact that you have guys like Marcus Tatum who've put in a ton of work. And I do definitely want to see, just from from my own perspective, and kind of a fan perspective too, I want to see Marcus Tatum succeed. That guy has put in a ton of work to not only just transform his body, but to the mental stuff he's had to go through with him. All you ever heard about him, and I'm guilty of this a little bit too. I didn't think he was going to pan out at Tennessee, but all you ever heard in his first few years of him at Tennessee was he's way too small. He's not going to pan out. He's not going to make it. He should never have been an SEC offensive lineman. To his credit, he has stuck around. He didn't transfer. He didn't quit. He didn't, he stuck with it. Like I said, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And he's been, I don't think you would argue with me, he's very much in line to be, one of the starting tackles for Tennessee, at least to start the season. We talked about it last podcast. He's a guy who I said haven't heard a whole lot about during fall camp, but he's a guy who I think is going to be, playing a pretty big role for Tennessee in the season. I think he's going to be starting at least to start the year, but that could change. Darnell Wright's very talented. I think it's just kind of a matter of time before he, the light clicks on for him and he'll be starting for Tennessee. But I was saying all of that to get to this point here too. Another reason why I think it's being overblown, Ben, and I think you kind of touched on this a little bit. Jim Chaney as the OC, his whole the offense, everything there is his whole responsibility, and the weakest point of the offense, it's pretty easy, is the offensive line. Not only that, but he has a strong background in the offensive line. He played in the trenches when he was a player at Central Missouri State. I think he was a nose tackle, so I think he was on the defensive side of the ball there. But when you look at his coaching career, when he came out after he got done playing, after he served as an assistant at Cal State Fullerton, he came and coached the offensive line at Western Michigan. He came back to Cal State Fullerton, was their OC, but also coached the offensive line as their offensive coordinator. He coached the offensive line at Wyoming. He was the OC and run game coordinator at Purdue. He coached in the NFL for 2 seasons, the offensive line for the St. Louis Rams, and then coached the tight ends for them for a season. Yes, since he came back from the NFL, most of the time when he's been the OC, he's also coached the quarterbacks, but he knows what he's talking about, knows what he's doing with the offensive line, and he gets the credit for being kind of a quarterback guru a little bit. The things he's done with the offensive line at different schools has been pretty impressive too. You can think back to Arkansas's offensive line and how good they were in the 2 years he was there, how good Georgia's offensive line was when he was there. Even when they had last year, when they had some younger guys having to play, I mean, they still were one of the best offensive lines in the SEC. And this year, he's obviously gone, and Sam Pittman gets a lot of credit for it too. But they are projected, I think, Ben, you mentioned this in one of your top 10 preview pieces as far as what Tennessee's going to face. They could very easily not just be one of the best, or the top offensive line in the SEC. They could be the top offensive line in all of college football this year. And like I said, Sam Pittman does get a lot of credit for that, but so does Chaney. He deserves getting credit for some of that too. So it, to me, doesn't bother me a great deal to see Chaney out there getting onto the offensive line and coaching, because that's the weakest part of the offense. Sometimes you need more eyes on that. We didn't hear nearly as many people mention or kind of wonder why Jeremy Pruitt, he's almost always with the secondary. Every time I've been out there, he's almost always been with the cornerbacks and the safeties. But you mentioned last week, I think it was maybe that same practice actually, it was either Tuesday or Wednesday's practice, that he was with the defensive line. I mean, he was sitting there, and I watched in our practice video, he was there with Tracy Rocker, getting on to guys about needing to get lower, needing to, adjust different things on the defensive line. Yet I don't think I saw anyone saying, why is Pruitt with the defensive line? Does that mean Tracy Rocker's a bad coach? It just, for whatever reason, Ben, it just seems like a lot of the fans have zeroed in on Will Friend, and he's going to be the punching bag, the dummy that gets beat up if anything goes wrong. And I just don't think it's fair that I think it's fair to criticize a little bit, but man, I'm going to hold off my really severe criticism of Will Friend. We've said this in multiple podcasts before. I feel like I'm repeating myself, Ben, because I know we've talked about this in podcasts and live shows, but I'm just holding off on my criticism of Will Friend until he gets better players on the field. He's going to have better players this year, but even still this year, I don't know how much you can really take away. You can judge him a little more this year because of, like I said, the guys like Wanya Morris and Darnell Wright, and some of the guys you have returning like Brandon Kennedy, and if Trey Smith can play, obviously that's a big boost as well. But man, he just didn't have the team, the roster, and he also didn't have, like you mentioned, Ben. I mean, the guys for just a bunch of different reasons, whether it was not buying in, whether it was not understanding. I mean, they just didn't have the wherewithal last year along with the bodies. And I just think I think people are being very premature in their judgment of Will Friend right now.
Yeah, it's just time to go. Simple as that. The reason Jim Chaney is breathing down the offensive line's neck is the same reason Jeremy Pruitt was working with the defensive line. Well, not even working with the defensive line, just keeping an eye on the defensive line through individual drills, is because it's time to go. The season's 15 days away. Tomorrow, being Saturday, whenever you're listening to this, 2 weeks from game one, and 3 weeks from BYU. And with the defensive line specifically, Tennessee is going to have better athletes than BYU at the skills position. But on paper, right now, BYU is better on the offensive line. So if Tennessee's defensive line isn't ready to go, then they're going to get pushed around. And if they get pushed around, that's a game Tennessee could very easily lose. BYU's left tackle and center are sophomores this year, but last year as true freshmen, they graded out as the two best freshman offensive linemen in the entire country. Their left tackle, Brady Christensen, was a freshman All-American. So it's time to go. That's why Jeremy Pruitt is keeping a watchful eye on the defensive line, not because Tracy Rocker is doing a bad job. Tracy Rocker is one of the best defensive line coaches in America. It's simple. It's time to go. And right now, I would say, I don't know if the coaches feel this way. This is me speculating, but I think the defensive line is maybe behind schedule. And some of that is because of circumstances that they couldn't control, that being that Aubrey Solomon still has not been granted an immediate waiver to play this year. And to be honest with you, I don't have a good feeling about that. This is me speculating, no inside information. But 4 Michigan players have transferred. 2 of them have been denied, and the other 2 are waiting. So I wouldn't hold my breath about Aubrey Solomon getting a waiver. Now I would, don't hold it against me if I turn out to be wrong, and I hope I am wrong, but I would not hold my breath on that. So the defensive line is behind schedule, which is why I think you're seeing Jeremy Pruitt, keep that watchful eye during drills. Because, again, if the defensive line isn't ready to go against BYU, they will get pushed around. People are going to look on at the logo on the side of the helmet and think, oh, traditionally Tennessee's a better football team than BYU, and they are. But tradition and what Tennessee has done all throughout their storied program isn't going to help them win that football game. So not to continue to repeat what I'm saying, but it's just as simple as it's time to go. And that's why you're seeing Jim Chaney and Will Friend pick up the urgency as well, just because the season's here. It's time to go. And Tennessee season, you and I have said it 1,000 times, Nathaniel, Tennessee season is going to be determined by how the offensive line plays, by how the defensive line plays. If they are a weak link, if they don't take a step forward, it's going to be a long season. So I think it's as simple as that in my mind.
Yeah, and not to belabor the point, like you said, we've said this I don't know how many times at this point, so we'll go ahead and kind of move on here a little bit onto the second main topic. But I did want to address that because we were asked about it, I think, in the mailbag. Maybe not, but I just remember seeing a lot of Twitter conversation. I remember when you posted, when I posted your practice notes from earlier this week, there were several comments on it, and it wasn't just on our stuff, it was on everyone's stuff. If you're on message boards, if you're on Twitter, even Vol Facebook stuff, I mean, you saw it everywhere about people talking about Chaney and Will Friend and just a bunch of different stuff. So I wanted to at least address it and talk about it for a bit because I think it was worth talking about and breaking it up. But I want to go ahead and move on to our second topic of conversation here, and that is, Ben, we've talked about it. You all have talked about it on the Swain event a lot. We've talked about it a little bit here on the podcast and different articles and stuff on RocketTopInsider.com. There's been a lot of talk about guys that have stood out this fall, guys that have caught attention, whether that's Henry To'oTo'o or Eric Gray, or as Tracy Rocker mentioned yesterday during media availability, he mentioned Greg Emerson and Latrell Bumpus as two defensive linemen who've kind of stood out to him. So we've talked a lot about guys, and in our last podcast we talked about guys that maybe aren't getting the attention, but who we think have had good fall camps and who are going to have big impacts on the season. There's been a lot of talk about guys who have stood out, but man, there hasn't been a lot of guys who've really had, I would say, bad fall camps, or guys who that have really done themselves a disservice or have hurt the team or anything like that this fall. I don't think we've seen a lot of guys kind of regress or have really necessarily bad falls or anything like that. But there are a few guys I think we both could circle on the roster and say that we want to see maybe a little bit more from these guys here in this last week of fall camp, and also heading into the week of preparation before Georgia State. So I'm curious. I'll ask you first because I know I have a couple guys, and one of them's kind of obvious, and it's one that I'm sure a lot of people will give the answer to. A lot of people know who I'm going to say, but I'm curious on your end, Ben, because you've watched mostly the offense and I've watched mostly the defense, so I think we might have good kind of contrasting answers here. Who are one or two of the guys you look at when you look at the roster here that you've watched at practice or anything like that you want to see a little bit more from? That doesn't mean they've had bad fall camps. Doesn't mean that they're dragging behind or anything like that. But I'm curious on who you think or who you want to see a little bit more from, and who you think hasn't lived up to their expectations, their potential so far in fall camp, and who you think needs to have kind of a stronger finish to fall camp.
I don't know if this guy has not lived up to expectations, but I would like to see more out of him. And this guy is Austin Pope. Honestly, I struggled to think of somebody along the offense, and I think everybody has had a fairly good fall camp individually on offense. I don't know that I would say anybody has taken a step back aside from Austin Pope, and then maybe Jordan Murphy, because one of the developments this past week in fall camp that I don't know has been talked about enough is the fact that Jacquez Jones has kind of moved ahead of Jordan Murphy in that slot position behind Jawan Jennings. So maybe Jordan Murphy as well. I think those are my two names, Jordan Murphy and Austin Pope. Jordan Murphy, quite simply, I expected more out of this fall. Thought I would hear him generate a little bit more buzz, and the only buzz that he has generated is that he allowed Jacquez Jones to pass him on the depth chart, at least through drills and practice.
Right.
That may not be the case August 31st against Georgia State, but at least in practice recently, Jacquez Jones was going in front of him. So I plan on keeping a watchful eye on that today during practice. So I'd say Jordan Murphy, and then I'd also say Austin Pope. I want to see more out of those two guys. Austin Pope is a big, physical guy who he could be that tight end that Jeremy Pruitt and Jim Chaney really want to complement Dominic Wood-Anderson. And we talked about it before. I think we talked about it on the last podcast or the podcast before. But with Jeremy Pruitt, the offensive philosophy with him in regards to tight ends is that he wants blockers first, pass catchers second. He wants those big, physical tight ends that Alabama has used for years and years and years now since Nick Saban took over. Yes, he has the athletic guy who can go out and make a nice catch and get upfield and get 10, 15, 20 yards or break off a big play. But more importantly, he wants those big physical blockers. That's what Alabama has every year. They always have some dudes you've never heard of, but they're big, they're physical, and they block you into the dirt. And when you look at Tennessee's tight ends room, there's a bunch of bodies there, and it has gotten better, but the physicality of the room probably still isn't where it needs to be in terms of overall strength. And part of that is because you are relying on two true freshmen, potentially, a walk-on, Princeton Fant. I've been impressed with him this fall camp, but he's kind of bounced around all over the team, playing multiple positions. Jacob Warren is he's added on strength, but he still has a ways to go to where he needs to be. So I look at Austin Pope and I'm like, dude, you've got the frame, the strength to be what this offense is looking for, and these coaches are looking for. And there's been days this fall camp where he's at the back of the line, he's taking off helmet in between reps, and maybe he's battling injuries that have not been disclosed by Jeremy Pruitt publicly. Austin Price did say on Tuesday that he's been dealing with a back injury. So maybe he's going last in drills, taking his helmet off in between reps because of those injuries. But he is a guy that I would like to see more out of as a fourth-year player in the program.
Both those guys you mentioned, Ben, were actually two of the guys that I circled as well, and I thought those would be the two guys you mentioned, because those are the two when just kind of looking at the offensive unit as a whole that I hadn't heard very much about at all. And when I had heard it, like you said, it's kind of been for kind of the wrong reasons for both the guys. So I think that's a very fair assessment. On the defensive side of the ball, for me, I look at linebacker, specifically at the pass rushing position or the outside linebacker spot. And obviously, Darrell Taylor's got one spot nailed down. I think DeAndre Johnson has the other one nailed down right now. That could change, obviously, during the season. I think Reverse Crouch will push for time there once he kind of gets acclimated. And maybe even Roman Harrison does as well. But a guy who I thought flashed enough in the spring to where I thought he was going to be able to make more of a move and maybe even challenge for that starting spot. I always thought DeAndre Johnson was going to be the guy who would end up getting the starting spot, but a guy who I thought was going to maybe challenge a little more than he has, that's been Kevon Bennett. And maybe it's just unfair for me to expect, he moved moved back from the defensive line to linebacker, and he's still kind of adjusting and working through, getting his body acclimated to a new position. Maybe it's just unfair of me and the expectation I put on him. But I wasn't expecting him to be, the far and away the starter on the opposite offensive or outside linebacker spot of Darrell Taylor. But he's a guy who I was, I thought he had a legit chance to kind of maybe be even a quote-unquote co-starter with DeAndre Johnson. But right now it legitimately looks like, and even early into fall camp, I thought Bennett was looking, pretty good early on in fall camp. But it just hasn't done much since then. And maybe that's just been, like you said, Ben, we get to see 10, 15 minutes at most of practice. So take all what we're saying here with a grain of salt. And, just because we've seen these things, make these observations, doesn't mean that's what's going to be the case come August 31st or come in September or October. But as of right now, I think Kevon Bennett's a guy I would put on the list of, I want to see a little bit more from him. Tennessee has a big need at outside linebacker outside of Darrell Taylor. And I do think DeAndre Johnson has, I think he has pretty good potential, but they're going to need more than just him. And, you would like to see Reverse Crouch come in, but he's still got a learning curve to adjust to. And I haven't seen a whole lot from the other guys. Jordan Howard obviously is going to be out for a while with the surgery he had to undergo. So I think my probably top one, I don't know if he's my top one, because I think that this other guy actually is my top guy, and that's Savion Williams. And that's not to say that Savion Williams has had a bad fall camp. He's just, for a guy that the kind of motor he has, the kind of work ethic he has, and the different stuff we saw of him posting, different videos and different things we heard from his coaches at Lackawanna. I thought he would be able to come in. It would obviously be an adjustment for him to the the style of practice and stuff that Jerry Pruitt and his staff want to run. I just didn't expect maybe as big of an adjustment as he's had to undergo right now. I think right at this point, he's struggling to get on the two deep at defensive line. And I didn't expect that. I thought he'd be pretty squarely in the two deep and probably challenging for a starting role, especially now with Emmett Gooden being gone for the season. But I just haven't seen it from him consistently. It's not, like I said, it's not because he's had a bad fall camp. He's putting in the effort. You can see it with him on the field. He's putting in effort. He's not just kind of lollygagging around and taking time off and stuff. He's a guy that is definitely putting in the effort. I've been a little disappointed in maybe the acclimation process, and that could change this week, and I hope it does change this week for him. And I think it would benefit Tennessee a lot if it changes for him this upcoming week. But to me, Savion Williams is a guy who I thought we would have heard more buzz about at this point through 2 weeks of fall camp, and we just kind of haven't. So that's kind of my two main ones. And the other one that I was going to mention that I think is fairly obvious is J.J. Peterson. But I also say that with a caveat of he has kind of put together a better – he did kind of put together, I guess, a second week of fall camp than his first. His first week was not the best. He came out – first day it looked better. But then those next 2 days – he was having conditioning issues, and it just was not looking very good for J.J. Peterson. You heard a lot of all fans, kind of saying, "Oh boy, here we go again." Thought he was going to be ready, but maybe not. But I will say he has put together, from everything you've seen Ben and other guys I've seen with their observations and stuff. He has put together a better second week of fall camp, and I would like to see that continue. I want to see that continue into the third week and heading into prep for for Tennessee's opening game against Georgia State. I would like to see that continue. So I think for him, it's not necessarily something I want to see more of. I want to see him continue to, put together what he did this second week. Because you've mentioned it, Ben, where he's a guy that, at one of your practice reports, he was along with Daniel Batuli and Will Ignont. Those have been kind of the leaders of the inside linebacker group. You mentioned that, Peterson was actually helping along one of the walk-ons through a drill and, kind of coaching him up. So he's showing he's growing. He's kind of a lot more engaged, I think, this year than he was. Well, he wasn't here this time last year, but during the practices in the fall, once the season began, I think he's more engaged than he was in the spring. So I think, to me, I just want to see him continue that, and I want to see the other two show more. But is there anyone else on the defensive opposite side of the ball, or even special teams, or anything, Ben, that you can think of that we haven't included? Because I think there might be another one I could mention, but I think for the most part, those are the three I would for sure kind of want to throw out there on the defensive side of the ball.
I would say Aubrey Solomon. I don't like the fact that he's been going at the back of the line this week in practice. I think that's a little whack to me. Maybe I'm reading into it too much, because the defensive line order has not made sense in drills. They've had a walk-on going second or third in drills this week, and to me, if you are an upperclassman, if you are expected to play a big role, if you are going to be able to play this season, then you should be at the front of the line every single time. To me, that's a little weird to me, and maybe it's a sign that he wasn't cleared to play this year, and that's why he's at the back of the line. I don't think that's the case, because I don't think Tennessee would. I think that news would have broke if that were the case. I think it's kind of funky to me that he's going at the back of the line. So that's one thing that I would like to see change. It's just the small details that add up to winning. And so that's something that a minor tweak that I would like to see. But other than that, there really hasn't been like one guy who's just been a complete disappointment this fall camp. So that'd be the only tweak I'd say, is you're an upperclassman, you're expected to play a big role on this football team if you're eligible. Why are you going through drills last? That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. And to kind of end the podcast here, I want to mention or have a little discussion here about Aubrey Solomon. And Ben, you kind of, I think you hinted at it earlier. I can't remember if that's when you brought it up or not, but I know obviously you just mentioned it now. What is your gut feeling with him? Because this is obviously we get asked this ad nauseum. Anytime I ask about questions for a mailbag, there's one or two or three questions about Aubrey Solomon. Anytime, y'all do a show at the Swain event when you have a guest on, whether it's Austin Price of VolQuest or whatever, there's questions about Aubrey Solomon. Yeah, if y'all get a caller or a text box or a Facebook Live comment every single day about Aubrey Solomon. So we're kind of tired of talking about it. It's this year's question it's this year's J.J. Peterson question. Last year we got asked, it felt like every single day about J.J. Peterson, and is he going to be on campus? Is he going to qualify? What's going on with him? This year it's been, what's the latest on Aubrey Solomon? Is he going to get cleared? Is he going to be immediately eligible? What happens if Tennessee doesn't get him eligible? Ben, you mentioned it there with him working in the back of the line with the defensive line group. What is your gut feeling on this? Do you think he's going to get approved for immediate eligibility? Do you think Jim Harbaugh is kind of holding this up a little bit? I think, and maybe it's just the pessimist in me, but I think at this point Tennessee is preparing a little bit more. I mean, we talked about it in the last podcast. We talked about it in the mailbag this week. We both think just by the way Tennessee conducts their practice that they've been preparing for him to not play, all along, because everyone gets an equal number of reps, and they've been, getting guys a bunch of different reps and stuff anyway. But if you look at the notes and stuff we heard, reports and stuff we heard from the scrimmage on Sunday, Solomon was playing a lot with the ones. I'll be very curious to see if we don't get any news on, his eligibility status here in the next 24 to 48 hours, what they do in the second scrimmage, and if they play someone else, if they don't give him as many first team reps. I think that the pessimist in me wants to say he's not going to get cleared. I would love for him to get cleared, but it's just with the way it's dragged on and then how long it's taking and everything, it doesn't feel great. But then again, there were times, probably this time last year, I thought J.J. Peterson wasn't going to be on campus and wasn't going to contribute, and then obviously that, he got on campus, he didn't really contribute, but he got on campus and was cleared to play, so I was wrong on that one. So maybe this is just kind of the same exact time frame for me with this one as it was for Peterson, where it just kind of feels like it's not going to happen, but it does end up happening. But I'm curious on your kind of gut reaction and gut feeling on it.
On whether Harbaugh is maybe getting in the way?
That, and whether or not you think Solomon's actually going to get cleared and eligible to play this season.
I don't have a good feeling about it. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the pod, this isn't, any inside information. It's just there's been 4 Michigan players transfer, 2 have been denied, and 2 are still waiting. And we know one of the ones waiting, Aubrey Solomon, it doesn't feel it feels like a weird situation. So I just don't feel good about it based off of that. And I don't know that I'm willing to say that Jim Harbaugh is blocking it or anything, because I feel like we would have heard rumblings if that were the case, as we did with the James Hudson, who transferred to Cincinnati. His family kind of raised hell about him not being eligible, and I think that would be a similar situation if that were the case for Aubrey Solomon. So I don't have a good feeling about it just based off the fact 4 Michigan players have transferred and 2 of them have been denied. What makes Aubrey Solomon's case different than theirs? So I don't feel good about it, to be honest with you.
Well, that's kind of a downer to end our podcast on, but that's just kind of how it happens. But we apologize for the downer comment there for both of us. Both of us are kind of feeling great about it, but maybe we'll be wrong. But like I said, I was wrong about J.J. Peterson. I thought for the longest time there, for several weeks before the season started, that he was not going to become eligible. And I remember I was about to head out for Tennessee's open. Actually, I was heading out to go cover a high school game, but then we're leaving the next day, or maybe I think it was early the next day for Tennessee's opener in Charlotte against West Virginia. But I remember about to get ready to leave for the high school game, and the news broke about Peterson was going to be eligible, was actually cleared and was ready to come join the team. The day before Tennessee's opening of the season, he was going to come join the team, but I think he actually didn't join him until the next practice, obviously the next week. But still, I remember that happening. So maybe it happens again this year, Ben, where we don't hear anything for sure until a couple of days before the season starts. I hope that's not the case. That would suck for Tennessee and Aubrey Solomon, but at least at this point he's prepared. He's been practicing, and he's not just like J.J. Peterson. He's not been kind of off on his own and not been with the team. At least Solomon's been with the team and has gone through practices and stuff. So if it does come very late that he's going to be cleared, it's not going to be nearly as big of a deal as it was for Peterson, and Solomon will be able to he'll be able to come in and contribute immediately. And you have Georgia State. If he can't even play a whole lot in that game, it's not a big deal. He'll be ready for BYU, you'd think. So hopefully he gets cleared, but we'll kind of see how that plays out. And be on the lookout for news today. When this podcast comes out, it'll come out about probably an hour, 45 minutes or so from a commitment announcement from 4-star outside linebacker B.J. Ojulari. He's choosing between Tennessee, LSU, and Auburn. It seems like he also has Georgia, Alabama, and I can't remember who the other team was in his finalist list there, but a lot of momentum towards Tennessee's way. We'll see how it plays out by the time this podcast comes out. By the time most of you listen to it, he'll have already made his commitment, so we'll know one way or the other. But that's a big-time decision that if it's for Tennessee, he's a very good player, and that'd be a very good pickup. If it's not, if it's the LSU Auburn, that's a big pickup for either of the Tigers there. So we'll see how that goes. And you also have next week, you have Mordecai McDaniel, who is a high 3-star safety, who's teammates with 5-star receiver Raheem Jarrett, who's making an announcement. Tennessee's trending well there with him. And you also have in-state defensive lineman Trevon Ripka making his announcement next week. Seems like it's going to be Tennessee or Kentucky, and really no one seems to know where he's going to go. We talked about it on the RTI Recruiting Podcast, if you want to check that out, with the guys at VR2 of all recruiting reports. And we all kind of feel like it'll be Kentucky, but really no one knows. He hasn't told either school. Both schools feel good about their chances with him, so we'll see how that plays out too. But that's just kind of a note of kind of what stuff to pay attention to. Wanted to plug the RTI Recruiting Podcast there for you guys as well. It's the same way you can listen to this podcast. You can subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts. You can listen to it on your Android device, whatever kind of app you use to listen to podcasts. It's going to be available there. And RockyTopInsider.com. If you click on the podcast tab, you can listen to it straight from that webpage or download it from there. And all our podcasts and stuff now are also on YouTube. Ben's been doing a great job of getting practice video and stuff up on YouTube, and he's going to, once we finish this podcast, he's going to head over to campus to go cover practice today. And so be on the lookout for our practice notes and our practice video as well. All that can be at RockyTopInsider.com and our YouTube channel, which is Rocky Top Insider also. Yes, Ben?
There's apparently there are no open periods for Tennessee football practice today, so no nice. Practice report or video today.
All right, well, there's a last-minute change for us. There is going to be no practice for Tennessee today, apparently. So that is an interesting thing. Actually, yes, Ben, I think I just now got the email myself. So interesting. All right, well, there'll be no practice on Friday, but there'll be no open practice on Saturday because I think that's when they're scrimmaging. But Ben, you mentioned Jeremy Pruitt, the head coach, will talk to the media on Saturday as well. Actually, it looks like he's going to be holding one. Tomorrow. Never mind, not today. So just tomorrow. So no practice on Friday, and there will be media availability from Jeremy Pruitt on Saturday. It's just kind of somewhat breaking news here as we're finishing up the recording of the podcast. So we appreciate all of you who've tuned in for this episode. We appreciate all of you who give us feedback and ask questions and everything that kind of spark conversation online and for our podcasts and our mailbag and anything else as well. But signing off for Ben McKee, I am Nathaniel Rutherford. Thank you all again, and this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.